there's a piece in this whole story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah that I think often gets overlooked. And it is the absence of Lot's ability to influence anyone in the entire region of Sodom and Gomorrah, apparently. Here's Lot. He's a nephew of Abram, who becomes Abraham, the father of many nations, through whom all nations on earth will be blessed. And his nephew traveled with him. His nephew left their home country with him. He heard, I'm certain, he heard the stories. He knew why they were gone. He knew that they were going to a land that they didn't know until they got there and God said, this is it. He'd heard all of those things from his uncle. And when he goes and lives in the Jordan Valley and sets up house near the city of Sodom and then eventually moves into Sodom, after he's been there for, I think this has been about 10 or 15 years, estimate, he's become a leader. He's one of the judges of the city. That's why he's at the gate when the angelic visitors come to visit Sodom and check things out. That's why he's there. He's become a leader in the city, but he has absolutely no influence. At least no influence for good among the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. He had a chance, he had an opportunity to influence the people around him, the community around him, the atmosphere around him in a way that might draw them closer to God and God's way, but had zero impact. Not even any impact on his own family. Now, in a day when influencer has somehow become an actual profession, I still haven't figured out how that happened, but it's a job now, being an influencer. Social media is involved with it. I'm not terribly influential and I'm not terribly good at social media, so that's out for me as a career choice. But in that mindset, I think it's worth asking ourselves, asking yourself. I need to ask myself, as I'm interacting in the culture and the circles in which I interact, which you interact, are you an influencer or are you just being influenced? We have been given the gift of the Holy Spirit as followers of Jesus Christ. The very God of the universe dwells in us and among us as the body of Christ. Are we making any impact? Are you making any impact? Are you influencing people around you in a way that draws them closer to God and helps them become more and more like Jesus Christ? Or are we simply being influenced by the culture that's around us? It's a question we have to ask. This is what happened with Lot. Abram became Abraham, lived in the land of Canaan, and while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Remember, they had a choice. They had become so prosperous and so wealthy as an extended family that they didn't have enough land to graze all of their animals on. Their various sheep and goat herders were fussing and fighting with each other. So Abram gave Lot the choice. Lot looked down at the Jordan River Valley where Sodom and Gomorrah and some other cities were, and he said, that's a really, really fertile, happening place. I'm going to go live down there. And he lived near Sodom. That was Lot's choice. He chose to put himself and his family in that environment and in that cultural context. And then like 15 years later, God wipes the whole place out. God couldn't find even 10 people in the entire region that could be described as righteous, living their lives in a way that was in right relationship with God and with the people around them. And wiped them all out. After all of that time, Lot had no influence at all. He failed to influence his community. He failed to influence his family. When you look at this whole of chapter 19, you see even his family hadn't been influenced by anything like faith in God from Lot. When the angels tell him, hey, we're going to wipe this place out. If you've got any family, get them out now. And so Lot goes to his future sons-in-laws. He's got 2 daughters, and he goes to their intended husbands and says, God's going to wipe this place out. Let's go. And they just laughed at him. Lot had so little credibility with them, so little influence on them, that when he tried to save their lives and warn them of the coming wrath of God, they just thought it was a joke. thought he'd lost his mind. As they're fleeing the city and they're making their way to the mountains, and burning sulfur is raining down from the sky, whether it was like showers of sulfur or whether it was some sort of, I talked about last week, perhaps a near-Earth explosion of a meteorite that wiped everything out of it. But as the destruction is happening, Lot's wife is so longing for this city that was so corrupt and so broken and so far from God that as it's being destroyed, she turns and longs to return to that way of living. Lot had no influence, no meaningful impact on his wife for the good. And then when they get in the mountains, and his daughters are all that's left of his family, and his wife is dead, and their intended husbands are dead, they decide to take matters in their own hands. They get their father drunk, and they get themselves pregnant off of him so that they can have sons and daughters to carry on the family. That's how little impact for good that Lot had on the people around him. I think Lot's story is a story of one of the greatest failures, not just in the Bible, but in all of human history. To have known the stories of God, to have known the power of God, that God, through his uncle, saved Lot and his entire family when they were taken captive as political prisoners. That God saved Abram and saved Sarah from countless difficulties, that blessed them and multiplied their wealth over and over and over again. And Lot had experienced firsthand all of this and failed to pass it on to anyone that he knew with any degree of credibility or influence. His family so completely steeped and influenced by the culture around them that they were simply part of that culture. And no one in the community would even listen to him. Lot failed to influence his family. He failed to influence his community. Why? I think one of the main reasons, maybe the reason that Lot failed to influence his family and his community is because he focused on the wrong thing. Lot, we see, and we get a hint at it. We don't get it developed and explained in any great detail, but we do know this: when Abram gave Lot the choice, did he want the highlands or the lowlands? Did he want the mountainous area, the hilly area, or the fertile plain? That Lot chose the fertile plain because that's where he could get richer. The land was better there. The nightlife was better there. There was more wealth there. And Lot never went into that environment to influence the people there. He went into that environment to make himself rich, to add to his own status, his own wealth, his own position in the community that was around him and in the culture that was around him. He was focused on the wrong thing. Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan toward Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east, and as we read earlier, pitched his tent near Sodom. Lot failed to influence because Lot failed to focus on the right thing. Abram was focused on God. Much of the time. Abram was not a person, even after he became Abraham. He made mistakes. He lost his focus along the way at times too, and bad things happened every time he lost his focus on God and started focusing on himself and on his circumstances, on what he could do to fix things and make things better. Every time he did that, things went bad, but Abram kept coming back to God, kept repenting. Lot lost his focus and he never seemed to get it back. He never seemed to get it back. And when we lose our focus on God, when we lose our focus on why we are here, and God was clear with Abraham, this is why you are here. I'm going to bless you so that you can be a blessing to the people around you. Every nation on earth eventually will be blessed by you and through you. That's your focus. That's your why. That's why I called you out of your homeland. That's why I brought you to this new homeland, so you could be a blessing to others. Lot went to the Jordan Valley so that he could be blessed by the resources that were there. Do you see the difference? One is an attitude of service that is willing to endure suffering for the sake of being a blessing to others. One is an attitude of selfishness, which says these folks exist to make me better and build me up. And Lot and his whole family got caught up in that. He lost his focus. Let's compare Lot to another real-life person who had a highly contrasting attitude toward Lot. And by the way, I found out earlier I've been saying Lot wrong my whole life. Apparently it's actually pronounced Lot. I was determined to do it properly this morning, and it didn't happen, and it's not going to happen. I give up. Eric Little, I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing his name right. If you know that name, it's probably because you're old and you watched the movie Chariots of Fire. One of my favorite, I think maybe the greatest sports movie of all time, just my opinion. Based on the true story, Eric Little was one of the main characters in that. He was in training in university in Edinburgh in Scotland to become a missionary to China. But he was also incredibly gifted as an athlete. He was a great rugby player. He played for the Scottish national team and did well with them. And he was very fast, a very fast runner. And so he qualified for the Olympics for the United Kingdom to go to Paris in 1924 and compete in the Olympics. When he got there, he discovered, before he got there, his sister, who was also of a missionary mindset, and other family and friends were deeply concerned that Eric had lost his focus, that he was leaving behind the calling that he had to the mission work of God in order to pursue the glorious life of an athlete and rugby and in Olympic running. And they thought he'd lost his focus. And Eric said, "No, I haven't. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, exactly what he said. He said, "I haven't lost my focus." And then the test came. Because he was part of a team, the track and field team, and the event he qualified for was the 100-meter dash. That's what he was going to run in. That's what he was going to compete in. He was one of the favorites to win a medal, maybe even the gold. But one of the qualifying heats for the 100 meters was on a Sunday. And Eric said, "I can't run on a Sunday. I can't do that." Now, he was already on the Olympic team. He was already in Paris. The Olympics were already starting when he announced to all of the people, I can't compete. And if he can't compete in the qualifying heat, he's out of the race entirely. England loses a chance to medal. It's done for them in that event. And the leaders of the British Olympic team were not happy about this, including the Prince of Wales, the Crown Prince of England. And at a celebration just before the Olympics were about to begin, they had this conversation with Eric.
Lord Birkenhead has advised us as to your attitude towards your participation in the 100 meters heats. Or would your non-participation be more accurate?
It would, sir, yes.
We were also consulted as to the correct manner in which to approach the French.
Something we just can't allow to happen. Going cap in hand to the frogs of all people. Simply out of the question.
Simple matter of national dignity, Little. Being a patriot, I'm sure you understand.
Well, I must say, sir, I felt it was an impractical suggestion from the start.
Well, why did you say so, man? As an athlete, you value economy of effort.
I wanted to run. And I was desperate enough to try anything.
Well, all that being understood, we decided to invite you in for a little chat to see if there's any way that we can help resolve the situation.
There's only one way to resolve the situation. That's for this man to change his mind and run.
Don't state the obvious, Cadogan. We've to explore ways in which we can help this young man to reach that decision.
I'm afraid there are no ways, sir. I won't run on the Sabbath, and that's final. I intended to confirm this with Lord Birkenhead tonight, even before you called me up in front of this inquisition of yours.
Don't be impertinent, Little.
The impertinence lies, sir, with those who seek to influence a man to deny his beliefs.
On the contrary, Little, we're appealing to your beliefs in your country and your king, your loyalty to them.
Hear, hear. In my day, it was king first, God after.
Yes, and the war to end wars bitterly proved your point.
God made countries. God makes kings and the rules by which they govern. And those rules say that the Sabbath is his. And I, for one, intend to keep it that way.
Mr. Little, you're a child of your race, as I am. We share a common heritage, a common bond, a common loyalty. There are times when we're asked to make sacrifices in the name of that loyalty. Without them, our allegiance is worthless. As I see it, for you, this is such a time.
Sir, God knows I love my country. But I can't make that sacrifice.
Little shared a lot in common with Lot. They were both living and acting and engaging in life and business and relationships among people who did not share their values, who did not share their beliefs, who had different goals, aspirations, and agendas. But Lot lost his focus. Lot's focus was on what can I do to get myself blessed? What can I do to increase my status, my position, my privilege? And Little's focus never wavered from what can I do to serve God? What can I do to bear witness into the world of the power and love and importance and significance of God and faithfulness to God? And in Eric's brand of Christianity, honoring the Sabbath was a very, very, very high level priority and value. And he said, no matter what, not for king, not for country, not for glory, not for fame, I will not go against what God has called me to in order to pursue what you're offering me. Glory and fame and status and privilege and honor and all of the things that go along with it. Eric, unlike Lot, never lost his focus. Here's an interesting thing about Eric Little. Eric ended up competing in the Olympics because one of his teammates who had qualified in 2 events had already won a medal in one of those events, and so he gave up his spot to Eric for the 400 meters. I'm not a track and field person. You're not surprised by this. But my understanding that running 400 meters, that's 4 times as long as 100 meters, right? Again, I'm no expert in track and field. When you train for a 100-meter sprint, you're not ready for a 400-meter run. Eric ended up winning the gold in the 400 meters in 1924. The next year, he went as a missionary to China, where he lived and where he died. 20 years he was there. He was there when World War II started. He was there when the Japanese invaded. He was placed in an internment camp, a prisoner camp, by the Japanese. Not a good place to be. And while he was there, he led Bible studies and he preached sermons. And he gave up his food and his medicine to people that were hungrier and sicker than he was. And he eventually died serving God in a prison camp in China as a missionary. Eric never lost his focus. And the impact he had in China and around the world is extraordinary. Extraordinary. Because rather than being influenced by the culture around him, he chose to keep his focus on God and influence people around him. Lot's failure had a massive impact both horizontally and vertically. I want to skip that slide other than to say this, that the children that his daughters bore through him became some of Israel's greatest enemies. 400 years later, they violently fought against Abraham's descendants as they were coming out of Egypt and back to the promised land. Lot's descendants stood in their way and tried to block them. Lot's failure had a massive horizontal impact. All the family that he knew was corrupted and destroyed in one way or another by the culture that surrounded them while they were in Sodom and Gomorrah, and by the judgment that God placed on that. Horizontal, massive failure. The entire region destroyed because of the lack of 10 people. 10 people. Let's think about it. Lot, his wife, his 2 daughters, and their 2 sons. If just, there's 6 right there, if I counted correctly. 6 right there. They only needed 4 more people to influence. Lot's failure of influence contributed to the destruction of an entire civilization. And Lot's failure to influence had effects for generations, for hundreds of years to come. Because he allowed himself to be influenced instead of keeping his focus on God. What does this have to do with us? It's an old story, and if you're not an Olympic runner who's also a missionary, what does this have to? Here's some practical implications for us. Beware of your own limits, including your capacity to influence. It's not really fair to put all the blame on Lot's failure to influence. The failure of focus was really the biggest problem. Because if Lot had been focused on God and right relationship with God, he might have recognized the possibility, in fact, probability of what would happen to him and his family if he moved where he moved and lived where he lived and did what he did. We have to beware of our own limits. Sometimes we want to have influence and we can't. It's quite possible that Lot went down there with great intentions and really did want to influence and simply failed. It was beyond him to do that. He was too easily seduced by what they had to offer, and so was unable to influence them meaningfully, unable to keep his focus. But we need to be aware of our limits when it comes to influence and our capacity to influence others. There is a tension between Jesus' example and his call to be a friend of sinners and Lot's example of pitching his tent near Sodom. This is a challenge that we have to constantly work out in our faithful following of God, because Jesus said, go be among the sinners. Don't build isolated communities. Don't build walls around yourselves, your families, and your churches. Don't bubble wrap everyone so that nothing in the world around them can ever touch them or reach them. Live in these insulated communities, insulated mindsets, and little silos so that you're never affected like Lot and his family were. Jesus said, that's not the way I want you to live. Go out there. Be among the world. Be a friend of sinners. Have dinner with them. Go to their house. Invite them to your house. Go out to lunch with them. Sit near them at the ball game. Have conversation with them. Build relationship with them. Jesus, that's part of what Jesus commanded. That's part of what the example that he gave us. That's how Paul lived his life and his mission life. And then you have Lot's example of the dangers of pitching your tents near Sodom, of being influenced rather than being an influencer. That's a constant tension that we have to live with. And it can't be resolved by simply creating rigid rules that says we're never going to hang out with those folks, we're never going to invite those folks, we're never going to live in those places, we're never going to let those people in our community. That kind of solution is out of bounds because it violates Jesus' example and call for us to be a friend of sinners. But Lot is a warning to us. And as a matter of prayer in our own lives and in our own faith, we have to be aware of where we can and where we can't be effective influencers, because there's too great a risk of being influenced. Simple example. Someone that's 3 years sober from drugs and alcohol probably shouldn't make the local bar their mission field. Right? You got to be aware of where your triggers and your landmines and your trip ups are likely to be, and say, you know what? That's going to need to be someone else's mission field. I'm not going to live in a silo. I'm not going to bubble wrap myself and my family, but I can't go there and I can't hang out with those folks. Sometimes it's a relationship with family or a person or people. And say, every time I get around them, I just everything goes bad. When I spent a lot of time working with kids in juvenile jails, and they would leave and they would come back. And 9 times out of 10, when they came back, the story went something like this. Everything was going great, and then I started hanging out with my old friends, and I was like, I'm going to hang out with them. I'm not going to do the drugs this time. I'm not going to smoke the weed this time. I'm just going to hang out. And I was hanging out with them, and then I was like, I'll just do it once, and then I was doing it a lot, and then I'm stealing stuff from my parents, and I'm doing this kind of thing. Because they put themselves back in an environment where they could not possibly keep their focus, where they could not possibly be an influence. And this is a balance that there's no law for it. It's a matter of prayer and discernment between ourselves and God and wise people around us that can help us see and say, yeah, no, you're fooling yourself. Don't go there. Stay away from those folks. You go over here and do that instead. Don't isolate yourself, but don't put yourself in a situation and in a context where you're almost certain to fail. So we have to ask ourselves, to what degree can we keep our focus on Jesus and his call in any given situation? That's it. That's just part of the life that we live. That's part of following Jesus. Choosing the difficult path of neither total isolation, as some Christian groups have chosen, and total immersion, which leads us open to being just repeating Lot's failure. And so it's a prayerful balance. Someone that I think is living out that balance at this point tremendously well is Maria Corina Machado. If you follow the news, I suspect you've heard her name a lot in the past few weeks. If you don't follow the news, let me tell you about her. Maria Corina Machado recently won, just a couple weeks ago, the Nobel Peace Prize, 2025 Nobel Peace Prize. She is living in hiding in Venezuela right now. She, by profession, is an industrial engineer. She comes from a professional family in Venezuela, and she had no interest in politics. She wanted to be a businesswoman, and she wanted to be an engineer, and that's what she was well on her way in being that and doing that. And politics got worse and worse and worse. And in Venezuela, and Maduro, the dictator there, was making life worse and worse and worse for more and more people. And so finally Machado entered the realm of politics and became a professional politician. And she spoke and wrote and taught and gave speeches and tweets and social media, all of the things that I'm no good at. She was doing really, really well against the powers that were there until she was accused of multiple crimes just to get her out of the way. And she wanted to run for election in 2024 as a president. They were having elections. She wanted to run. They said she can't run. The powers that be, Maduro said you can't run. So she convinced an old guy to run on her behalf. And he ran on her behalf. And everyone knew that he wasn't running, that he was just kind of a stand-in for her because her name wasn't allowed to be on the ballot. She got 90% of the vote in hiding. Well, she's now in hiding. She's still in the country, but no one knows where she is. Most of her supporters don't even know where she is. And she still insists that Maduro's government's going to fall. Her family had to leave the country. Her children are in danger now. Her family's in danger. She's in danger. But she has continued, and she has continued to push for democracy and peace and freedom in the country of Venezuela. And she's a staunch Christian, acting out of her faith. Her particular brand of Christianity is Catholicism. And she walks when she was free to do so, went through around her country, praying everywhere she went for her people, receiving gifts to remind her to pray everywhere she went. Rosaries were often given to her, and rosary is just a tool for prayer that many Catholic folks use. And her faith is a tremendous part of what has motivated her to put her own life at risk and even her own family at risk. But here's the thing. She could have gone the other way. She could have simply bent the knee to the powers that were around her, gotten along to go along, going along to get along, to fit in, to reap the rewards, to do all of the things that you need to do just to, get the favor and the blessing of the powers that be that are out there. And she chose not to do that. And there was great danger in that. There's great risk in that. And a lot of people that give into the cultural influences around them, they do it seeking a sense of safety. They want to protect themselves. They want to protect their family. She chose to risk herself, and she chose to risk her family. Here's the simple fact, is that Lot went along to go along, and his entire family was destroyed. There's not necessarily any safety in that. But here we have a real-life person in our world right now who is seeking to be an influence rather than simply to be influenced by the culture around her. And her faith is part of that. And she's making a difference. Maybe one of us in this room will one day win a Nobel Peace Prize or some other prize. I can guarantee you it's not going to be me. I just know that. But these big level things, they're great for us to view as examples. But for the vast majority of us, the question is not at the scale of international politics. It's at the scale of our family, our school, our workplace, our community, our county, maybe our state and our country, a little bit. But are we being an influencer or are we being influenced? Are we keeping our focus on God? We're allowing our focus to drift into what can we do to serve ourselves? These are the questions that Lot and Eric and Maria, they all ask us to reflect on. Let's do that in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.